Hello, hello. The title says an email sent to NYU Wagner. So, NYU has a PhD in health policy. And I reached out to them January 25th, 2026, to inquire about their program. I included in that email a handwritten letter from prison that was addressed to the Attorney General of the State of New York, Letitia James, whose office represents the interest of Stony Brook Hospital. Now, my agendas have been more quality related. I recently wrote somewhere, or I shared with somebody, um, that my socioeconomic status allowed me to focus on quality of care rather than the finances of care. So, growing up, I grew up upper middle class, and I never had to worry about paying for, an office visit. I didn't have to worry about referrals, and I wasn't concerned about Medicare and Medicaid. I was just concerned, I was just interested in delivering the best possible product to the patient, having the best experience possible for the patient and for doctors, improving quality of care. There are some things related to finance in that I wanted to reduce the amount of training involved for doctors, increase doctor pay, which came later on. The increase in doctor pay thing, that comes from observing my father. So early on, he says, I make $200,000 per year. This was when I was like, 12, 13 years old. When I was, 30 years old, he was still making $200,000 per year. And so there wasn't, an increase of pay for him. And that, there was an increase in the cost of training for doctors. So the student that's coming out of medical school in 2015, 2020, they're going to be making $200,000, but they're going to be significantly much more in debt than my father was coming out of medical school. And 200,000, that's mid-career type thing. So the cost of training has increased, the cost of living has increased, but the pay for doctors has not increased. That's about the only one. I've also wanted to introduce paperwork reduction acts for doctors, which might reduce some stress for them and allow them to focus on more patient-related things. Of course, all this would involve doctor and patient input. I wouldn't just, let's create a policy that does this without doing any type of surveying or research. And but when I was preparing for medical school, they said, they like to ask you about Medicare and Medicaid. And I always felt like those are things that I can learn, before I don't have to become heavily invested in them. I can learn those when I'm applying. Medicare for the elderly population and Medicaid for individuals who make less than a certain amount. Now, the letter I shared with them, this is it. I'm not going to go through the entire thing because some of the um, letters include my social security number, so I have to be concerned about privacy. Um, but I have a situation where I go over the harms I experienced by 911 responders and hospital employees, and There's this first letter here was sent as part of, I have what I call this 13-page letter of intent, where I present a case against Stony Brook Hospital, and my case has merit. I had it notarized on the 12th day of November of 2025. Then I include this Suffolk County Correctional Facility Classification Questionnaire Receipt 4, and I wrote a little note on here, and this just indicates, you know, my status in the prison, as well as gives some insight into my arrest. This was also notarized. It was, so we had a couple copies. So we had, this one was notarized on the 12th day of November, and that original copy was sent to Letitia James as part of a package that was not mailed registered. It was just, in a manila envelope with a bunch of stamps on it. I would later send it again. So then I have this thing. They had something called inmate request forms. If you needed, if you wanted to go to mass, if you wanted records of your inmate account, if you wanted a haircut, you had these little inmate request forms. And so I wrote another incident report. I sent this one to the staff at Yafeng Prison, and they returned it to me. So I had it notarized on the 12th day of November 2025. Then also in that package, I included a journal. So when I was in prison, I would journal my experiences, and originally they started to kind of like demonstrate what my day was like, my day-to-day affairs, and also to maintain a sense of self. I felt a disconnect from the person I wanted to be and attempted to be for my majority of my life. So I wrote, this is there's a first part to this journal. It's not necessary for the context of this email. This is a journal entry regarding the agendas that I shaped from grade school. So when I was, 10, 11 years old, I started planning my life, where I, planned my future career and my plans to have children, where, I plotted out, at the age of 11, I plotted out the next 24 years of my life. And where I intended on going to Chaminade High School. I was going to go to a college on the tier of NYU. I was going to go to medical school. I was going to complete my residency. I was going to complete my residency at 29 and then finish a fellowship around 30, 31. And I would get married around 30, and I would spend 5 years with my wife. We could raise capital together for our children that we would have in our mid-30s at the age of 35. And we would also spend quality time together without children, because I didn't want any unplanned pregnancies derailing my career goals. So I say today is still October 28, 2025, RC. That stands for Roman Catholic Calendar. I know AD is something, but I put RC. That comes from the Church of Resurrection across the street, where they put RC to indicate that the church is Roman Catholic. The time is about 10:25 p.m. I can't see the clock all that well, and I believe it is a few minutes fast. The Knicks are in the fourth quarter with the Bucks, and the score is 108-103 in favor of the Bucks. I am taking a course on child sexual abuse, and I want to take this time to reaffirm my goals. My pursuit of healthcare policy is rooted in my relationship with my father, whom I love. I already completed coursework in health and hospital law at Seton Hall School of Law, which I am truly grateful for, but as much as I appreciate the coursework, I should have focused on pharmaceutical law there, as it includes coursework pertaining to direct-to-consumer marketing. My father would, on occasion, discuss the science of endocrinology, such as the process of glycolysis, but much of my life was affected by my father's relationship with his drug reps, the practice of giving doctors gifts, pharmaceutical campaigns, and public perception of doctors. There were some individuals who felt doctors prescribed medication based on kickbacks from the pharmaceutical companies rather than sound professional judgment. I have been to the 1999 and 2000 World Series on the dime of drug reps. However, a few years later, they abolished this practice of giving doctors gifts, such as baseball tickets, and my father would have to buy his own tickets. We would eventually get season tickets. The public perception that doctors prescribe medication based on gifts and made a lot of money made me defensive of my father. My father would describe to me how much training doctors receive, which includes 4 years of undergraduate studies, 4 years of medical school, 3 years of residency, and if you were specializing, 1 to 2 years of a fellowship. People like myself plan for medical school at a young age due to the rigorous and lengthy path that is highly competitive and requires strong academics. Medical schools boast a 94% retention rate as of 2015, compared to 60% for graduate schools. This could be due to the rigorous entry admission requirements, but could also be due to the selection pool being full of individuals who are dedicated and passionate about the field of healthcare. My father also taught me about the liability where he must carry medical malpractice insurance and take the Hippocratic Oath. He told me how just by being included in a medical practice suit, you could face financial consequences, such as not getting a reduction in your insurance premium. My father also gave me insight into the economics, which included doctor pay, how much his pay increased over a certain period of time, how long it takes an insurance company to reimburse you, patients dropping out of insurance during a grace period resulting in no pay, the expectations insurance companies have when they are owed money, and overhead expenses for his private practice. He also told me starting a private practice had upfront cost, and some of my life decisions were based on the plan of inheriting my father's practice, which could save me in the expense of starting my own practice. I figured with all the money and time doctors spend on training, liability coverage, and business expenses, why would they risk it all on a pair of baseball tickets that amount to about $500? I felt and feel that my father has integrity. I take no issue with doctors profiting off of inside information as part of their training and practice to stay up to date on clinical trials and up to date research. On my father's off days, he would spend a substantial amount of time reading peer-reviewed journal articles such as JAMA, the New England Journal of Medicine, and the Endocrine Society. I had an agenda to change public perception about doctors being a glamorous profession. There are other careers with higher pay ceilings that require less training and allow for more creativity than medical doctors. The professions likely have a better quality of life where the individual can spend more time with family and leisure activities. My interest in direct-to-consumer marketing goes beyond public attitudes towards doctors. I feel that since the pharmaceutical company can reach the consumer directly, they don't need doctors to be a shill for their medication. The patient can ask for it by name. This potentially creates a drug-seeking behavior where patients are asking for something they do not need. Beyond public perception and drug-seeking behavior, I do have interest in quality control, making sure the product is safe and effective. I adopted reduction of harm agendas, which were not specific to pharmaceutical, and included the patient experience, which might be anxiety-inducing. I also had an agenda to improve quality of life for doctors, which might include paperwork reduction acts to reduce the time a doctor spends on non-patient related work, such as referrals. My vision of healthcare also included computer-assisted diagnosing, which could alleviate some of the burden placed on doctors and doctors in training. I would sometimes refer to doctors as having to learn the Library of Congress of diseases, which might include diseases that have been eradicated by vaccines or other advancements. I thought it possible to reduce the amount of time spent training doctors. As to the best of my knowledge, doctors spend more time in medical school, 4 years, than any other profession, such as lawyer, 3 years. Something crossed my path once that indicated there is some resistance on this front because it would be unfair to those who spent more time in training. To be fair, my father has benefited elsewhere, not that he was one of these creating the resistance to this cause, as he does not need to retake the board exams every 3 years. He is grandfathered in. As mentioned, quality is a concern of mine, not that I experienced any while initially shaping this agenda, but have since. Sorry, sometimes I'm having a little difficulty reading my own handwriting, so I'll start this paragraph over. As mentioned, quality is a concern of mine, not that I experienced any while initially shaping this agenda, but have since, and I did not want to develop technologies without having learned about the body first at a certain level, such as medical school. For example, I learned early in my life that organ transplants can be rejected, but I never learned what materials would be compatible with the body. I have since learned materials such as ceramics, glass ceramics, and decellularized extracellular matrices can be used as scaffolds for tissue engineering. I thought about creating an internal blood monitoring system inspired by the glucose meters my father would give at his practice, and a DECM could potentially house the sensor that would be inserted into the body. My technology would therefore be slightly invasive as it requires placement in the body. A much referred to experience pertaining to quality and liability is when I went to my friend Will Young's home and he mentioned he was cramping. I told him to take some. Now I just want to say right now, in here I say zinc. I don't think in that moment I said potassium, and I'm not sure. I used to tell this story, a bunch, and distance from that time in my life has, gone up. That was when I was 13 years old, and but to the best of my knowledge, it was not potassium that I mentioned. So I said zinc. To which his mother remarked, "Ooh, our little doctor," which made me self-conscious because I was not yet a licensed medical provider, and I did not want to be handing out unfounded advice. I was concerned about the liability and therefore vowed not to give out advice without being qualified first. This ties into my vision of counseling, where I wish to instill confidence in my clients, implied by my credentials, and facilitate trust by projecting a compassionate, sympathetic caretaker, one that the clients would feel comfortable divulging sensitive information. The therapeutic alliance and safe space environment are central to my vision of counseling. My graduate studies, is littered with examples to support my position on the therapeutic alliance and environment. According to Herman, for patients who have experienced trauma, restoring trust is a goal of therapy. I want to give these individuals time to heal, which may include time it takes to open up about their experience, which brings me to the next topic, managed care setting. In the past, I have held the belief that unions are too strong, but that doctors should unionize so that they do not have to bend the knee to insurance companies who might want to dictate care. This comes from a practice of insurance company audits where the company tells my father he cannot code a certain way, and when insurance companies send correspondence that your triglycerides are elevated even if it falls 1 unit outside of the normal range. Your doctor may take more blood work to see if the value is still out of range, while the insurance company might have you start medication after the previous blood work. I was a captive audience at a lecture on person-centered in a managed care setting at Saybrook, as my vision of my practice has always been one where I am control, so I dictate care. From that lecture, I learned that you need a diagnosis after the first visit, which, as you might see in my abnormal psychology course at Seton Hall, is not always possible. We studied a case of a woman who was having auditory hallucinations following childbirth. From the information, we could not conclude if this was due to schizophrenia, as that diagnosis requires the symptoms to persist longer than 1 month, and brief psychotic disorder less than. So the we only had 1 day of symptoms. Schizophrenia requires 6 months. I started this letter on October 28, 2025, and have not added to it since. Today is November 10th, 2025. The time is 12:12. The time is 2:12. I felt the entry might be missing some of my interest in counseling psychology, which I pivoted to after my grandfather died, and my experience as an undergrad, where I experienced complex, prolonged grief. However, after rereading the letter, I see I do mention the therapeutic alliance and safe space. I will now take the time to discuss chilling effects, VR sex therapy for the sexually abused, and a more recent addition, a clinical test for competence to declare mature minor status. The story goes, I was at the gym circa 2012 when I saw the news report on the flurry of mass murderers during the Obama administration. The media would portray these gunmen as mentally ill, and I became concerned for individuals who had fairly benign conditions, such as anxiety or depression, who may avoid seeking care for fear of being associated with mass murder and violence. I made a mention of this in a Facebook post in 2015 where I said after the death of Robin Williams, I felt this was an opportune time to discuss the stigma of mental illness, and then I would continue advocating for that population. I regret making that statement because, as you may see, my healthcare agendas were not specific to mental illness and include quality of improvements for doctors and patients alike. While taking the law of patient care at Seton Hall School of Law, I was introduced to the term chilling effects and did some policy analysis on the SAFE Act, which included referencing an article that used epidemiology to demonstrate that gun control for the mentally ill is more about reducing self-harm, and that media portrayal of the mentally ill might create an incorrect association with mental illness and violence. I further stated that gun restriction registries might also create privacy issues, as being on one could identify a patient as having been to a psych facility. I described it as backdooring HIPAA. I still want to explore chilling effects, but using a policy framework where policy can fortify the therapeutic safe space and alliance. Someone already wrote a dissertation in 2017 on treatment-seeking attitudes of college students in the wake of gun violence. I intend on sending a copy of this to the AG Letitia James, who I believe I already sent some information about my new dissertation proposal. I have breakfast coming, so I might take a break right here. But the point I'm emphasizing right now is that these are quality related things. These are not really financial things. These are related to quality of care. All right. I had breakfast. They forgot the bacon. It says lettuce, tomato, bacon, wrap, add mayo. They added the mayo. They didn't put bacon on. Shelby, are you ready for this? It says, as far as VR therapy goes, according to Navidadol, VR therapy can be used for individuals experiencing PTSD or agoraphobia. I read this text while taking abnormal psychology at Seton Hall, but I have mentioned my idea of using VR therapy and out of work porn stars to provide therapeutic benefits to individuals who may have been sexually abused or experienced sexual trauma. I guess in the past, yeah. I got the idea from the Oculus Rift consumer version 1, not the dev kit or the current Oculus Pro Quest, where I played a game, a shooting gallery, that would put you in a room with other individuals. Having had experienced social anxiety, I could say that this immersive environment replicated feelings of being in close proximity to another individual and feelings of anxiousness similar to where I had experienced with social anxiety. I thought of an idea of using individuals that are comfortable with intimate contact, such as porn stars, to allow the patient client to touch another individual and feel intimacy without actually touching another individual and being in a controlled, safe environment. I also thought of using this environment for standard talk therapy, where the identity of the client could be masked by an avatar, increasing privacy and potentially serving as a mask that could serve as a form of liquid courage. The instructor who gave the person centered in a managed care setting lecture discussed finding a client someone to date, have sex with, and another CBT told me he resorted to finding a hooker for a client. I discussed compassionate touch in my counseling psychology residency from the perspective of what is appropriate and also what is billable. 2 minutes of compassionate touch. After I took the law of patient care, I had a desire to advocate for minors to empower their medical decision making. This is based on the idea that they will have less regret later on as they have ownership of their decisions. I use a hypothetical HPV vaccine that carries a small risk of infertility but is required to attend boarding school. A student might say, I can abstain or practice safe sex practices where I have sex with people who have been tested for STDs, and therefore getting the vaccine would create a greater risk for infertility than would exist had the student not have gotten the vaccine. For these individuals, this is an unnecessary risk, but without mature minor status may be forced on them. I then enrolled in Children's Health and the Law and started shaping the idea of a clinical test for competence to declare mature minor status. I asked Isaac Martinez at Saybrook if he would be my chair for the idea that I wanted to use for my master's project, but he told me it was a dissertation idea. I was also approved for research on sexual abuse and doxing, which presented a gap in research. I want to be a trauma-informed therapist that serves an undergraduate and graduate population who might have their studies affected by grief or tragedy. I also wish to provide legal counsel to these individuals who might be uncertain how taking a bereavement leave might affect their studies. For example, their graduation status or scholarship. This is better explained in my Who Am I paper, aka my vision of counseling. So I hope that that little snippet demonstrated somewhat that I have an affinity for healthcare policy, and then I have shaped agendas related to quality of care. I don't know if the age is apparent, but these are from like These started taking shape from grade school, and some of them were affected and shaped continuously over like a 20-year period. So I had an aptitude for science. I was advanced in math and science. I was um, on the honor roll. I got grants and scholarships to go to college. I have a bachelor's in biology. Um, there are, I got an A in developmental biology. I also got an A in developmental psychology or human development. And I got an A in ethics in both graduate school and undergrad. And I feel I carried myself for the most part growing up with one as a person of who had moral integrity and was concerned for the well-being of other people. I have been the victim of police violence, false imprisonment, medical malpractice, so my worldview has been a little bit shook, where I am perplexed as to how others could engage in such egregious behaviors towards me when I would never do that to them. I'm going to stop this narration and hopefully my AC will be fixed today.